Hey Amarillo, I'm Jason Boyett, and you're listening to Hey Amarillo, the interview podcast featuring some of the most interesting people and stories of Amarillo, Texas. Today's guest is Lauren Hough, and Lauren is someone I've wanted to interview for a long time. She doesn't live in Amarillo now. She makes her home in the Austin area, but Amarillo is a big part of her story, and it is indeed a story. Lauren grew up in a doomsday Christian cult, which has gone by a lot of names, but it was called the Children of God. You may have heard it referred to as the family. But because of this upbringing, she ended up living all over the world. And you can find a lot of that story in her critically acclaimed New York Times bestselling collection of essays called Leaving Isn't the Hardest Thing. That book came out in 2021, is really, really good. But eventually Lauren left the cult and she moved to Amarillo. And then after Amarillo, she joined the military during the 1990s. Those were the don't ask, don't tell years. And because Lauren is a lesbian, she ended up requesting a discharge. And those years in the military and after the military led to a lot of really interesting life experiences. But what I love is that Amarillo and West Texas have always been critical parts of her story. Today, she's working on another book. She's writing for magazines like Texas Highways, where she has become something of their correspondent for Amarillo and the Texas Panhandle. And when one of those assignments brought her to Amarillo a few weeks ago, we finally got the chance to sit down for an interview. So here's Lauren Hough. Lauren Hough, welcome to the Hey Amarillo podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm honored to have you. I know we've been attempting to do this for several months as you come in and out of town because of some of the writing that you're doing. So I'm glad that we could connect and actually sit down. I always start with my guests and ask, how did you end up here in Amarillo? And I know that like you've written an entire book of essays that kind of chronicles that, and it's a complicated story, but I want to let listeners, if they don't know you, hear a little bit about that story and how Amarillo fit into it. Kind of walk me through the bare strokes of your upbringing and life.
It's always, I never know where to start. Amarillo is actually probably a good start. We moved here when I was 6 because my grandmother lived here. So it was a place that we'd been living. This is why my story is weird. We'd been living in Chile and Argentina, going back and forth. We moved to Amarillo and moved in with my grandmother.
Your grandmother had lived here for a long time? Like, was she pretty planted here, even though your family was kind of itinerant?
Yeah, my family's from here. Before I was born, my parents joined a cult called the Children of God. It was also called the Family. It's not one of the fun ones. Yeah, when I was 6, we left and moved here, and I can't tell you what elementary school I went to. I was just thinking about that because that's one of those password questions.
You don't have it. You lived in too many places, or
no? I just use
you
that.
don't want us to guess your password.
That's the verification question.
Okay, that's fine. Well,
that's weird. They're all related to Amarillo. Like my first job, my elementary school.
That's funny.
The street that I grew up on.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you lived in a ton of different places, but Amarillo ended up being sort of an influential one, at least in terms of password questions.
Yeah.
Which we can't get into. What part of town did you live in?
Paramount.
Okay, Paramount area?
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about what Amarillo provided you? Like, did you get some sort of stability when your family ended up here as opposed to how you were growing up?
Yeah, that's the first thing. The first thing I do when I come back here is I drive past my grandma's house, and she hasn't lived there in 20, 30 years. But I drive past her house. Eventually, they're going to start wondering about that person who keeps driving past their house, I think. But this was the place where I went to school down the street. This was the place where I have those memories that when people start having conversations about what they were doing in high school, middle school, or whatever, these are the stories that I have that relate to people. Because it's the problem with even talking about a cult, because it's so weird and so different that
it's hard to relate.
If I'm having a conversation with you and one of those stories comes out, then I'm telling you a story, and suddenly I'm the most interesting person in the conversation, and I'm not actually. But it's that word.
Yeah.
So now there are 20 follow-up questions, and we can't get back to when your brother shot you with the BB gun, which is the story that I really want. So yeah, all of my normal don't start an entirely new conversation for a party stories happen in Amarillo.
How long were you here?
We moved to Oklahoma City for a little while when I was 8 or 9, so probably 2 years, and then we came back when I was 15.
Okay.
So another 3 years. So like 5 years of my life, probably.
2 different periods.
Yeah.
But enough that it kind of plays into your identity more so than the other places you lived?
Yeah,
Is that
weirdly.
accurate? I mean, it's the parts of childhood, your teen years, those early elementary years that like stick with you. I mean, the music you listen to as a teenager is the music that still hits you at age 40, you know? And so like those are influential moments.
They're huge moments. And then all the songs you were crying about, now you actually understand and have a reason to cry to them. Yeah, I was a very melodramatic teenager. But yeah, now REM hits a little different.
Yeah, it does.
It hurts in a very different spot. Yeah, they're kind of who they make you. I didn't used to tell people I was from Texas because when I said that I was going home for Christmas or going home for the holidays, I was going up to my brother's house in Massachusetts. So everyone just kind of assumed I was from Massachusetts, and I'm not, but I just went with it because again, it's too long a story for just a party, and then you never want to correct the thing, and suddenly people are buying you Red Sox gear. You're like, I guess I'm a Red Sox fan now.
But like it's in your bio that either you were from West Texas or sometimes you mention Amarillo specifically. Which I mean that for someone like you, you've lived in so many places. Like, why is that one of them that gets on the list?
Here's the thing: it doesn't hurt to be from Texas.
Okay.
If you want to be a writer, and it doesn't hurt to be from a small town, because now that story that I was trying to avoid my entire life is kind of useful. So yeah, I don't have a college I can brag about that I went to. I can't say that I went to the Iowa Writers. I didn't.
Yeah.
But I can say I'm from Amarillo.
That adds enough interest.
Texan branding isn't
background.
bad outside of Texas. It is a little bit, but they do want to hear the stories.
Yeah. I don't want to presume that listeners will have read your books or any of your essays or the cable guy essay that went viral, any of that stuff. I do want to give them an idea kind of where Amarillo fit on your timeline. So like, was this coming out of the cult as your parents were leaving it? Or was it kind of in the middle of things?
The first time we had left it. The second time we joined again in Oklahoma City.
Okay. So you left it and then went back.
Went back in. We went to Japan and Switzerland, and then came back to my grandma's house.
Okay.
Really, life could have been very different if my grandma hadn't been that awesome woman who always took us in. Because thinking about it now, like her daughter runs off and joins a cult and then just shows back up. Hi. Can you house us and feed us for a couple years? I weirdly couldn't, I don't know that it's that shocking. I couldn't wait to get out of here. So I joined the Air Force and ended up eventually in D.C. When I got out of the Air Force. And that's, I think, really the bulk of the last book is all the crazy jobs and stories of being young and queer and kind of living on the margins in Washington, D.C. So, yeah, Amarillo was just the place that I was from that I didn't talk about, it wasn't until I moved back to Austin in 2015. I came up here just for a Texas Highways story, and it's one of those things, everything looks smaller than it was. I thought my grandma's house was this mansion, and it's just a house. I thought Tascosa was massive. Everything's kind of smaller except the sky, and that it still knocks the wind out of me. So just looking at it and driving up north where it's just grassland and looking at the sky, I would do it just to feel that feeling in my chest.
Yeah. One of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, obviously the book of essays is interesting. It was New York Times bestseller, and then you had Amarillo in your bio, but like, you talked about Texas highways, and for the past, I don't know, 8 or 10 years, like you've been writing about this area for, publications in Texas. Like you've kind of become the Panhandle person for Texas highways. I don't know if that's an official designation, but like that's why you're here now. And so, yeah, tell me why. Like, and does that feel like a good fit for you?
I love coming back here. I will fill up on Taco Villa, and yeah, I eat way too much Taco Villa when I'm here.
Well, you and me both, but I live here, so.
But I do love coming. I wish you would send me to the beach sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
That would be cool. But no, I somehow, the Texas Highways editor, this guy named Mike Hoinske, and he is really persistent. He was messaging me for, I think, 2 years, asking me if I wanted to write something. And it's not that I didn't, but I had no ideas. And I remember I asked my brother about it, and he started telling me about some murder, like 5 generations back in our family or something. I don't know. There was a coroner who was elected who declared it a hunting accident, but it wasn't. And I don't think he's read anything I've written. That's how I figured that out. I called him on it too. It's funny.
That's not my thing.
I was like, I don't do true crime. I don't even know how to do true crime. This feels like a lot of research. And I had nothing, but I had my grandfather told me this story. It was right before he died, actually. He had Alzheimer's, and I was watching him in the afternoon. And he started telling me this story about Bonnie and Clyde. And then I couldn't figure out if he was pulling my leg. I asked my dad about it, and he's like, no, it was Dillinger. Dillinger was in Chicago.
Yeah.
Wait, is this story real? But also, he'd heard the story before. So I told the Texas Highways guy, all right, I have this. My grandfather told me this story. I don't know how you would write about a thing like that. And so you go to Shamrock and you find out if it's true, and then you write about going to Shamrock and finding out if it's true. I think we should make it clear that I have faked my way into being a writer up until this point. I have no idea what I'm doing. I like writing, and I think I'm kind of funny, which is sometimes a problem. Yeah, so I went up to Shamrock, and it was fun. It was fun as hell. I was walking into places with a little composition notebook and taking notes like I was doing a research paper, but I'm way too old to be doing a research paper. And telling people that I was doing a story for Texas Highways, which helps a lot.
Yeah.
People are so nice to you.
Yeah.
It just, everything changes as soon as you drop Texas Highways. I do that now. I was driving around the country, and I gave that to a border guard at the Canadian border coming back into the States. He said, what do you do? And I'm a writer. Who do you write for? Texas Highways. Everything changes at the border.
That's interesting. I want to talk about that part of it because, like you said, like you had a bunch of careers. None of them were writer until you were a writer. How did that happen? Because you went from having written an online essay about being a cable guy to like having a book deal and a book of essays. And like, did that feel like something you were equipped for, or did you just feel like, oh, here's this thing, I guess I got to write a book now?
I did everything backwards because I didn't know how to be a writer. I got very, very drunk after a breakup and emailed an agent in New York that I'd written this book, and then had to send a follow-up saying, I'm sorry, I had to get drunk to send this.
Had you written the
I
book
apologize
at
for
that point?
The typos.
Like,
I
did
had,
you have...
but it was terrible.
Okay.
It was a really bad memoir of the type that I assumed people would want to read, because it was a lot of what I'd been reading lately. I didn't really want to write it. It was really bad. But she emailed me back the next morning and agreed that book was terrible. And but she said, but you can write and you have a story, so let's work on that. So we did, and then that book didn't sell. No editor wanted it. It was another terrible book. And I gave up. I had given myself, right around the time, I had a midlife crisis, like you do.
Mm-hmm.
I'd been living in D.C., I was working as a cable guy, and I was miserable. And all I ever wanted to be was a writer. So when I got that agent, I was like, I'm going to do this. I will give myself 5 years to figure out how to make this work. So I sold my house, saved everything, and moved here because it was cheaper. Moved here also, or moved to Austin as a backup plan because Texas veterans could go to school for free.
Okay.
Like if the writer thing doesn't work out, at least I'm in Austin. I'm going to school.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be a cable guy anymore. Like, this is ridiculous. You work outside and you start getting old. You feel it. And yeah, there's a timer on my body. So I failed. I was writing more bad fiction, and I'd gotten on Twitter and kind of noticed I was pretty good at the format, just one-liners. I was like, all right, well, at least this is a way to meet writers and talk to people in publishing and try to figure out what I'm doing. Yeah, I wrote a Twitter thread about being a cable guy, and one of those people I'd made friends with said, hey, my editor wants a story about this. So I wrote a thing that I thought no one would read. Why would they? It was cable guy stories.
And it was long.
It was really long. It was really long.
Yeah.
It's like a 15, 20-minute read at least, which doesn't sell.
Not today for sure.
No. And yeah, it went, at last count, something like 12 million people have read that thing. It was 8 million in the first weekend.
Man.
Which is insane. So yeah, that thing happened, but we don't have phones anymore. But it used to happen in a movie where someone had this thing and then suddenly all the agents and Hollywood people are calling them.
Yeah.
That happened in my Twitter DMs, so it was just a complete.
Wow.
I don't want to cuss on your show. It was a mess.
Yeah.
Things had, yeah, it was a mess. We'll go with that.
But all of a sudden,
yeah, suddenly
the industry was interested.
Yeah, suddenly I had a book deal, and I got to choose which editor I worked with, which is massive, because different editors want you to write different books. And one of the things I really didn't want to do was write a cult tell-all.
Okay.
I thought I had to.
Like you thought that was the thing that made you interesting, that people would want.
And then no one wanted it.
Okay.
I'm like, great, well, now I don't have to do that. Suddenly everybody wanted it, but I think they were right the first time. There's just too many of those, and I didn't want to do it. So yeah, I got to write it the way I wanted to, which was a book of essays where I can reflect on the cult. And in some ways, getting people to read your book is sort of the putting sugar in medicine thing of, you can have some cult stories, but here are the things I actually want to talk about. And it's a lot more fun way to writing essays, because you can jump all around. And as long as you bring it back there at the end, it kind of works sometimes. So it's just fun.
You went from that to you're working on another book that's still in process. You're writing the magazine articles. Like, do you feel like a writer now? I mean, does it feel like, well, let me ask it this way. Does it feel like what you thought you wanted when you were determined to become one?
I think I complain about it a lot more than I imagined I would, and then have to remind myself that I'm doing exactly what I wanted to do, which is pretty cool. I also kind of made a living out of complaining, so I'll probably keep going with that. But
it's a good thread for an essay. I mean.
Yeah, there's that. I don't know. I get to do field trips for a job, which is crazy. I get to go into a museum is my job, and the talking to people thing can get a little harder. I'm really hard at starting the conversation. Once the conversation gets going, and if you say Texas highways, people just want to be quoted, so they will say all sorts of fun stuff. And then you just have to scribble really fast. It's funny, when I started doing the Texas highways pieces, I really wanted people to know that I was a writer and I worked for Texas Highways. And now I'm calling people up and saying, all right, so it's basically a research paper, and I don't know what I'm doing. I have to get a lot of quotes so that I can turn them into a story somehow, and just anything you say or do that would help with that, that's what I need. And yeah, I'm no longer pretending to be a writer, so I feel like more of a writer, because I don't need people to know anymore.
Okay.
So I think that
that
matters.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, you lose some of the guardedness people might have if they think, oh, a whole bunch of people are going to read this versus this is just a research paper that nobody's going to look at.
I've had people take me seriously, and it's really uncomfortable, so now I need them to not. At first, I desperately wanted them to.
Mm-hmm.
Then I experienced it, and it's not a lot of fun. So yeah, I've gotten back to, I'm good.
How do you feel about Amarillo or the Texas Panhandle now that it's a place that's part of your history where you used to live, but you're a different person than you were as a kid? Most likely, you're approaching it with the eye of a reporter, which is a little bit removed. And like, how does this area hit you now as an adult coming back to it?
The friendliness is actually jarring to me. Having been on the East Coast or even in Austin, which is just full of California now.
Is it jarring in a good way or in an uncomfortable way?
It's jarring in an uncomfortable way for a split second, and then I realize that it's sincere. It takes a moment to adjust of, oh, this is really happening. The first time it happened was I went to a Sonic because you have to go to Sonic. I was very excited to see one, and I didn't have a tip, so I went in and asked for change for a $5, and I was going to buy a pack of gum at the place next door so I could run back over and give the woman a tip. And they just gave it to you don't have to buy gum, and acted like I was ridiculous for that. Nobody was going to give me change in DC. The concept was insane. That someone would just do that. Or I was in the grocery store buying Tasco's hot sauce. I have to do all the hits, and I was going to take a case back with me too. And someone just started talking to me at the grocery store in the same aisle about hot sauces. My first instinct, are they drunk or a crazy person? Or am I someone about to ask me for money and tell me a story about how they ran out of gas? But no, it's just, they're just talking to me. And then it's fun. And then I go back to where I live and start talking to someone in a grocery store, and they look at me like I'm about to ask them for money.
That's something we take for granted here, that you don't find out is like abnormal until you leave the area and make eye contact with somebody on a street, and all of a sudden they look at you like,
I was walking
like you're
my
a crazy
dog
person
this morning, and some guy on the street from a vehicle just started talking to me about my dog. And yeah, that's, unless you're a kidnapper, you don't do that in other places. You just don't.
I want to ask you a personal question. I mean, this is a podcast, I guess it's all personal, but you are someone who was in Amarillo, especially during your teenage years, figuring out that you were queer, and also having come out of a cult in a place like Amarillo that is very theologically, politically conservative. Like, did you feel like you belonged here, or did you feel like an outsider? Had you spent your whole life as an outsider? Like was there a barrier here?
It's a little mixed up because I don't know how much of it was from the cult, and I don't know how much of it was from me being a very closeted queer high schooler.
Okay. So you hadn't quite figured it out in high school, or you just weren't out at all?
You've seen a homeschooler from a distance, right?
Yeah.
And you can spot them from a distance. So I was already that. So yeah, I always felt a little bit separate, but so I don't know how much of it was from being queer. Coming back now, I do feel a little less safe here.
Okay.
I haven't used a public bathroom in the Panhandle and probably won't ever, because yeah, it does feel a little less safe. And I don't know if I would have felt that as a teenager. Probably. I worked at that Taco Villa on Coulter, and I think a lot about a conversation we had all just gotten off work. We were drinking out of the back of Rocky's truck and discussing, where we were going to go next. Do we go shoot hoops? Do we go? There was a party somewhere, but I didn't know the guy. One of the guys wanted to go throw beer cans at the queers coming out of Maggie's, and I went home, and I didn't even at the time know that I was queer. It was just that was brought up so casually and agreed to. that'll be a great time. That sits with me because those guys who in that culture knew that that would be a perfectly fun thing to do on a Friday night sits with me because they're my age now, and I don't feel safe completely, but I don't feel unsafe. And it's that jarring thing if people are so friendly and so kind. And I think if you're not, I think if you don't have friends or family that you know, and a lot of people do, but I think if you don't, you have this caricature of, what a queer person looks like. And there's a whole fight about, it's funny that the fight is about trans people in bathrooms, but I'm not trans, but it makes me feel less safe in a bathroom too, because it's all kind of connected.
There's a larger conversation to be had about that, and that there are a lot of people maybe that grew up like you, and because of that inability to feel safe, or the casual, let's go throw beer cans at people sort of mindset, like that's a reason for you to leave. And it's a very valid reason for you to leave. And so the people who might not fit or might not challenge those conceptions all end up leaving. And the ones who don't want to be challenged end up staying. And very slowly that starts to, solidify a culture here. And I wonder if you think about that, how many people like you grew up here, but then got out and maybe, had to find a place that was different enough from Amarillo so that they could thrive.
I think it does affect a place. There's this, I wish I could name who came up with it, but there's this theory that because the AIDS crisis killed so many gay men in the 80s and the 90s, that our art scene suffered in every aspect of it, in music criticism, in film criticism, in film itself, in Broadway. I think having sort of that artistic brain drain can actually happen to a town too, where the art scene and the queer scene are intrinsically linked, and you lose your queers, you lose your bands, you lose all of the people who kind of make a city fun.
Mm-hmm. And
I think it can get a little mean. If all your weirdos are gone, what do you have left?
Yeah. And Amarillo has, for all the problems, we've kind of prized ourselves in being a place for weirdos.
We had some great weirdos. Amazingly, and some of them might have been criminals. I still,
we'll not name names, but
we don't. But I think you have to value your weirdos. That's how you end up with a punk scene. That's how you end up with an underground music scene. That's how you end up with people who cannot do any other sort of work. So they open a food truck, and it's like these bomb-ass burritos that you would never get anywhere else. But all those fun ideas, I think, come from, you've got to value your weirdos.
Yeah. The last question I want to ask, and this is one I ask a lot of guests to kind of close out this first section, but are you surprised where you've ended up? That you are a published writer? That you've come back to Texas? Do you look back and think, this is not what I expected?
I think sometimes, way too often, just kind of how close I was to the edge of how many times I've lived in my car. I moved to DC to live in my car with the idea that I would be able to just get a job and find a place to live. And then I did the same thing. I sold my house and moved into Winnebago with the idea that the only way out was to be a writer. I think it's kind of good to back yourself into a corner, burn the side of the bridge you're standing on sometimes so that you have to go forward. There are nights I can't sleep until I count, how many steps I am from losing any of this again. And there are a couple steps now. They can cancel your award, but they can't take best-selling author out of your name. That's always going to be there. You can see a really long way from any place on the edge of this town. This is not one I saw, but I'm happy it happened.
This episode of Hey Amarillo is supported by Storybridge, an early childhood literacy program. Here's an incredible stat for you. Kids who grow up in homes with more than 20 books receive an average of 3 years more schooling compared to those who grow up in homes without books. But in the Amarillo area, only 1 in 5 children owns more than 20 books at home, just 1 in 5. And so that means a lot of kids are entering school without any kind of foundation for learning how to read. Well, Storybridge is working to change that. Since it launched, this nonprofit has distributed more than 650,000 age-appropriate books to local kids. And through the Dolly Parton Imagination Library program, they provide a book in the mail every month to 8,500 local children, all under the age of 5. It takes your donations to keep this work going. So I encourage you to give or get involved. Visit storybridgeama.org. That's Storybridge at storybridgeama.org. Okay, I'm back with Lauren Hough. Lauren, this is the part of the show I call 8 Straight. 8 Straight is sponsored every week by Panhandle Plains Historical Museum in Canyon on the WT campus. It's the largest history museum in Texas, and it's known for its educational programs. Last year, more than 500 different researchers from around the state and nation visited the museum to use its research center, library, and archives for various projects. In the past, people like Larry McMurtry or Ken Burns or Timothy Egan have taken advantage of these resources. There's so many weird books and documents about the history of this place that just a researcher can go access and look at. So you can learn more about that at panhandleplains.org. Okay, first question. I know you don't live here currently in the Panhandle, but when you think of the Panhandle 10 years from now, what do you hope for?
I think it's easier to see when you haven't been here in 10, 20 years, and then you come back into town. It's gotten bigger. It used to end, when I left, we had just gotten that Barnes & Noble on Sauncey and the Home Depot. That was very exciting.
It's the edge of town back there.
Yeah, that was the end of it. And it keeps growing out. It would be really cool if some of those old buildings downtown, and I see that it's happening, which is really cool. Some of them are hotels now, which is cool.
Yeah, the Barfield.
Like it was a ghost town.
Yes.
At the same time that I left. I don't know. I hope I come back in 5 years and, there's a streetcar there and it's turned into like the place people go. And the place people lived. Some of those old bungalows are really cool.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know how. I'm not in charge of anything. I don't know how a thing happens. I'm just really happy to see that it's starting to. People are moving in there.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Other than wind, and we can talk about that if you want to, but what does this area have too much of?
Chain coffee shops. Y'all have roasters. I don't think you appreciate how good Roasters is.
Yeah.
I've been a lot of places, and Roasters is so good. I don't know why there's a Starbucks here. That's ridiculous. You have a roast, and they have drive-thrus now.
We've got Roasters, which is homegrown. We've got Palace, which is homegrown. And we still have Dutch Bros and Starbucks.
Nobody needs Dutch Bros. Nobody. We just got one of those on my street.
That's if you want coffee that is blue or yellow somehow, and not.
It's unnecessary. Yeah, you have really good coffee shops. I do. I was kind of bummed the one in Wolfland Village, or I guess Wolfland Village is kind of gone. But there used to be a Roasters there.
Yeah,
right? And it was the
OG location was there in Wolfland Village. They've since moved across the street.
I was never cool enough to hang out there, but I mean, my brother spent a lot of time there.
Yeah,
but,
I remember that one.
Yeah,
and then I remember the Burger King that is now that Roasters on Georgia.
Yeah,
it was a Burger King like in the 80s when I was a kid.
I worked there one year.
Did you?
Yeah.
That one with the little terrarium sort of windows and stuff like that? You've worked in a lot of places. Taco Villa. Okay, what does this area not have enough of?
Taco trucks. I got to say, severe.
Coming from somebody who lives
painful
in
lack
Austin.
of taco. I'm not trying to sound like that person from Austin. Also, it's a terrible place. Don't move there. Everything's gotten so expensive. It's ridiculous. All the worst people just moved there. But you can run all of your errands and talk. If you have to get gas, there's a taco truck. You need new tires, there's a taco truck by the tire place. If you go to the DMV, there's a taco truck across the street. You can get a taco at every stop on the way to your entire errands. And then when you go to HEB, there's a tamale truck in the...
Okay.
You're good to go. That's your shopping done for the week. Because now you have fridge tacos, you have the taco that you just ate, you have the taco that you're going to eat when you get home, and you have tamales.
We've made progress in the food truck world over the past 5 or 6 years, but we're still behind. And so I agree. I hope it continues to grow.
Yeah.
I agree. Okay, what's your favorite Amarillo neighborhood?
I got to go with Paramount. My grandma lived there.
Okay. That's
that
a cool
little-
neighborhood. Like,
Yeah.
I grew up in the Paramount Terrace neighborhood off of Virginia Street.
Yeah, there was that cool playground, that torture slide.
Fleetwood
what's the
Park,
name of that?
Paramount Park.
Yeah, Paramount Park. And
Hot metal, tall slide, super dangerous.
they had that bug thing or the spider with all the legs, and you had to try to climb up into the bottom of it.
Mhm.
I think I broke my nose on that one time. I was standing on my brother's shoulders, and he let go, and I mashed my nose on that
I spent
thing.
time in that thing. There was one of those merry-go-rounds that there was always some big kid who would spin you so fast that small kids would fly out.
The grass is still very green in that location.
Yeah.
From all of our blood.
I can't believe those doesn't exist anymore.
Teeth.
That is a great neighborhood. What's your favorite Amarillo restaurant?
Shiley's Barbecue.
Yeah.
I think it's on 3rd.
Yes. Just
Yeah, down
west
by-
of downtown.
Yeah. That place is amazing. Yeah, I'm going with Shiley's.
Okay. Yeah. Shiley's is always
Ribs.
good. Tremaine Brown has been on the podcast, the proprietor there. When you talk to outsiders about Amarillo, what do you tell them about?
It usually comes up when someone's trying to tell me about the weather. I spent a winter on Cape Cod, and people kept telling me, "Oh, it's going to get really windy. It's going to get really cold. Be prepared for this." I am from Amarillo. That is one time I'll always claim it, is if I have to win a weather argument.
You will always win it.
Have you ever heard of freezing fog? We have things that you don't know.
We had mud snow, not too long ago. So,
Yeah, you can't. Don't talk to me about the weather.
okay.
Yeah, I talk about the weather, and I cannot stop talking about the sky.
Yeah.
And then people think you're crazy because they don't understand how much. It's a lot of sky. Leave here and come back. Every time it knocks me out. It's great.
You've lived in a lot of different places, including Europe, Japan, South America. What's the most underrated aspect of having lived here? Like, is there something here that we take for granted?
I weirdly got a really good education over at Tascosa. My English teacher, Mrs. Ross, gave us spelling an entire week on media literacy, how to know what a trusted source is. So, and every time someone will send me something from the internet, and if you couldn't put it in a research paper for Mrs. Ross, that's not a good source.
Yeah.
Media literacy is. I actually learned that here, which is nice. Man, Taco Villa is a really underrated aspect.
I think that's true.
You can't.
It's
is-
consistent. It tastes the same now as it did
It
in the
tastes
80s.
exactly the same. The salsa is exactly
Yes.
the same. Yeah, it is a truly underrated aspect.
Okay, last question. When was the last time you visited the Big Texan?
That was 2 years ago.
Was it for a story?
No, I conned a friend of mine into letting me borrow her teenager to watch my dog, and then she wouldn't accept payment. So for payment, she wouldn't let me pay her, and I was like, well, why don't we go to dinner? So picked the Big Texan, and the place is efficient.
Yeah.
I don't.
They know how to
understand-
run 500 people through a dining room.
I don't understand how they're so efficient, but yeah, there are no errors. Everything.
I don't understand how
know
they
exactly that is
cook that many steaks
That is
at
run
once.
by an army. I don't. That is impressive.
Okay.
And it's good.
It is.
It really.
We like to make fun of
good.
it as people who live here.
Well,
like,
yeah, you have to.
But if you cook 500 to 700 steaks a day, which I think is an accurate number,
And they're all perfectly cooked.
like, you know how to cook a steak.
consistently.
Yeah.
Consistently. I don't know. They should be probably in charge of FEMA.
Well,
Yeah.
they may end up in charge of FEMA at the rate we're going. Bobby Lee and Danny Lee
Yeah,
are
it might not
running
even be a
things for
good
the
joke
government.
anymore.
Okay, that
Don't-
concludes the 8 straight questions. I like to close by asking my guest to endorse something. So what's one thing you would like listeners to know about or to experience?
Listen, I don't want to tell anybody how to live their life. But I lived in DC, and I shouldn't. Because, I lived in DC for 15 years. Never went to any of the museums. Sometimes when someone was in town, we would go to the monuments, and then they would get tired and hot, and we'd be like, yeah, look, can we go get a drink now? I told you. Never went to any museums, and they're free, and they're everywhere. The Panhandle Plains Museum is amazing. So is the art museum here.
Yeah.
The Quarter Horse Museum is cool. I do field trips for a living now, and it turns out right about the time you stay up all night watching the Dust Bowl documentary,
Yeah.
like it's the cool new show on Netflix. Yeah, that you'll love museums, and they're so much fun, and they're indoors. So that's all.
I fully agree with that endorsement. Lauren Hough, thanks for being on the podcast. I appreciate it.
This was so much fun. Thank you.
And that concludes the episode. I want to say thanks to Lauren for the interview. You can learn more about her work. You can order a copy of Leaving Isn't the Hardest Thing at laurenhoughauthor.com. Thanks to Storybridge and Panhandle Plains Historical Museum for supporting the podcast, and to Angelina Marie for editing every week. And thank you for listening. Hey Amarillo exists on a weekly basis because of the listeners like you and the local people who support it financially. Hey Amarillo's executive producers include Patrick Burns, Katie Linker, Jason Burr, Josh Wood, Corey Burns, Cindy Graham, and Barbara and Jim Witten. This has been episode 397. My name is Jason Boyett, and I'll see you next week.